Okay, so this is a guide to the Counterbalance Forklift pre-use checks. Truck we're using is a Toyota Tonero 5FBE18 Category B1 counterbalance with a lifting capacity of 1,656 kilos. Just got to remember you need to carry out these checks whenever you start your shift or take over from another operator. So first things first, we can check our fork arms. Obviously they're going to be carrying our weight, so we need to make sure there's no structural damage to those. Have a look at the fork arms, looking for any cracks or splits in there, specifically checking the fork tips. Both tips should be the same shape and there should be no damage there, and at the fork heels there's also no cracks or damage there. Working your way up the back of the heels, you'll see the fork locating pins which locate into the carriage plate. Got to make sure that they're not missing, that they're not damaged, and that any welds at the rear of the fork heels are all in place as well with no damage there either. Forks are held onto the carriage plate, so we need to make sure the carriage plate's in good condition. That's the top piece of metal on the bottom. Just make sure it's lightly greased and that any carcellation on there for locating the forks isn't rounded off. It's nicely cut, and any bolts in place there are nice and secure. We don't want the forks jumping off the carriage plate. If your truck's fitted with a side shift functionality, you'll notice there's another carriage plate behind it. You've got a little arm at the top hooking over and an arm at the bottom. You need to make sure that both of those are in good condition, and again there's no cracks or splits or damage. And if you've got the side shift, must make sure you check the side shift rams, those are the shiny bits, for any leaks, and the cylinder as well. Moving on to the mast, have a look inside the mast for any debris that might be there getting in the way, and have a look at those rollers just to make sure there's no damage to the roller. And externally on the mast, you're looking for any evidence of impact or any damage there. Down the centre you'll see the hydraulics for the main lift cylinders. Make sure there's no leaks on there or on the ground if it's been parked overnight, and the chains and hoses running down the mast should be in position and not likely to impede, and again no debris in the track. You can see the track there. If you look at the back of the main lift cylinders, you'll see two hoses there. Those hoses don't actually carry any pressure. They are hydraulic return hoses, so that's where the hydraulic fluid's coming out the cylinder, going back to the tank. Make sure there's no leaks in there though, because where the fluid's coming out, you don't want any hot hydraulic fluid coming back into the operator's position. Checking the lift chains inside the mast, need to make sure that they're in good condition. No pins are sticking out either side. Should be lightly greased with no links missing there either. If you follow the chains up to the top, you'll notice they go over the top of the chain pulleys. So chain pulleys need to be in place with any circlips holding them in position. Circlips not missing, no damage there, and the chains nice and central, sat nice and square on the pulleys. You'll notice there are two nuts the other side as the chains go over to make sure they're secure. Just make sure they haven't loosened off at all. As you can see there, the hydraulic hoses and chain going up and down through the pulley, there's no damage there, and that they're not impeding any other function. With hydraulic rams and cylinders, very similar checks on there. This one is the tilt hydraulic ram and tilt cylinder. The ram's the shiny bit and the cylinder behind it. First things first, make sure the ram is attached where it should be and the cylinder is attached where it should be. Any rams should be three things: clean, dry and shiny. They certainly shouldn't have any hydraulic fluid leaking out of that cylinder seal there. If it does, that's something to report. Okay, just make sure they're nice and clean. Okay, moving on to wheels and tyres. As you can see, we need to be checking the wheel nuts there. You can either check that with a torque wrench or just tap them with a spanner, and they'll be making a different sound if they're loose. Making sure that we've got adequate tread on there, there's no chunks missing. This tyre here is a solid rubber tyre with quite a low wear line, but you'd need to identify where the wear line is on your particular truck. If it's pneumatic tyres, don't forget they're going to need adequate air pressure. Tyres at the rear, you'll notice there that you can't actually see a great deal of the tyres there. So what you can do is to mount the truck and turn the tyres round one side, and you get a very clear view of what's on that side. Turn them round to the other side and you get a very clear view of what's round on the other side as well. When the tyres are turned, you'll notice from the photo that you do get quite a large picture of what's there. When they are nice and straight, just also make sure there's nothing caught up between the two of them. External condition and counterweight, need to be making sure there's no damage to the truck. Obviously we've got panels down the side there to prevent dust or even fingers from getting in the working parts there. Make sure they're in place and that no part of your counterweight is missing or broken off. Obviously that would reduce your lifting capacity. Check the overhead guard, the rollover protective structure and the falling object protective structure, looking for any obvious signs of damage there. You can see where the overhead guard comes down and joins with the truck. You've got a little green arrow and a circle there. Need to be checking any welds there or any bolts that are holding that in place. Obviously, should an emergency arise while we're operating the truck that is a tip over or something falling on top of the truck, that's going to be the protective structure that's potentially going to save our lives. So we need to make sure that any welds and bolts are all in a good strong position there should that happen. Operator's position and operator's seat. You obviously want to be comfortable, so first thing to do is check the seat, make sure it's in good condition, that it's securely attached, it's not going to be coming off. Checking the seat belt, the shackle and the belt. Check the stitching on the belt to make sure there's no damage, and when you draw the belt all the way out, you're making sure there's no sign of acid on there or any corrosion or any damage that would weaken it. Also make sure that the seat belt will not release unless you push the button. The last thing you want is a weak shackle. Checking the fluid levels and the battery compartment is a nice regular task. So at the front on the dashboard on this truck we've got the brake fluid there. If you pop open the rubber cap you'll have the brake fluid. Make sure you've got enough in there, and particularly for brake fluid that there's no debris or any dust or stuff in there. Open up the cap, we've got 24 cells in circuit there. You just want to make sure the cells are good, that there's no damage there, and the water level should just be to the top of the plates. There should be no corrosion on the outside of the cells. Make sure we remember to close the cells before we operate. Remember, appropriate PPE is acid resistant gloves, goggles and an apron. Check any battery connectors and sockets there. Make sure that the battery plug is all in place and secure. Any cables there are in the housing properly, not exposed at all, and that when it is plugged in, the cables are sat in a position where they're not going to be cut or interfered with by anything else. Behind the cells on this truck we've got the hydraulic fluid filler. If we open up the cap there we can take out the dipstick. You'll notice that the fluid level here is around about the 60 mark. If we stick a black line where the fluid is just there, in a second we'll stick a line where the maximum is. You'll notice a difference there. Don't worry too much about that. That's because the hydraulic fluid that would fill that gap is currently out inside the rams. We are fully tilted forward. If we were to tilt back, obviously the fluid would return and that level would rise. When you close the cap, make sure that the cables are not sat in that position, which would cut them. Make sure they are within the appropriate grooves or housing to make sure they're not going to be damaged at all. Required markings. First things first, really important, check our rated capacity plate. As you can see, this truck is rated at 1,656 kilos at a 500mm load centre. Important to stress, you must be familiar with your own rated capacity before you start operating so you know what you can lift. Check the thorough examination date on the truck. Trucks require a thorough examination every 12 months unless they're fitted or using attachments, used for more than 40 hours a week, or lifting people, in which case the thorough examination goes down to 6 monthly. In case we're operating during the night time or dark conditions, need to be checking the lights. Nice easy checks on there. Just switch the lights on, make sure the bulbs are working, and any brake lights or indicators as well. And also make sure that when we switch on the lights that any dashboard lights illuminate so that we'd be able to see any warnings or anything we might have to see on the truck. Don't forget to check your overhead amber beacon, either flasher or a rotator. Just make sure there's no damage there and it's working. With audible warnings on this truck, nice easy checks on there as well. Just give a little toot on the horn so you're happy that the horn's working for blind corners and warnings to others. And if you flip the truck into reverse, you should hear the buzzer as well. On this truck we have a seat pressure switch, so you can hear the truck buzzing there, beeping away to warn us that there's nobody on the truck and it's switched on. Check that's working. And we've also got a micro switch behind the handbrake. So what we'll do is we'll just use a micro switch there, make sure it's working to warn us if we've accidentally removed the handbrake when we shouldn't have done. Hydraulic operation, again, really simple on this one. We're just going to use each one of the hydraulic controls to make sure that they activate the correct motion, that it's nice and smooth, and that none of the levers are sticking. So when we do remove our hand from that, they're not going to keep going or doing anything that we're not under, that's not under control. If you've got side shift, don't forget to check that. You might not use it too often, but it's important to do it. Other thing to mention with the hydraulics checks, obviously the video here shows the mast being tilted. It's important to check the hydraulics to the full extent of what they're capable of doing before you put any weight on the truck. That way you'll have a nice indication of your structural integrity. Just make sure everything's working. You can see from inside the mast here, as we're raising up, you can see the chains and the hydraulic hoses going over their rollers. Notice it's a nice smooth movement, it's not being impeded by anything, there's no debris there. When you get to the top of the mast, it's important to stop for a couple of seconds and just leave it there. It shouldn't come down on its own at all. Okay, if it does, that's certainly a dangerous condition and we won't be using the truck, so they should stay exactly where you leave them. When the forks get to eye level, it's important to check the taper, so thin at the front, fat at the back, no damage there. Check the forks for any damage at the bottom of the forks, and also make sure that the tips are at the same height, so neither fork is bent. If we look from another angle, as the carriage plate comes down, where the two circles are there is where the chains are attached to the back of the carriage plate. Really important, that's the only opportunity we really get to check their security, because we can't see them when they're at ground level, so take your chance to check the rear of those chains there as well. Next thing to do is to check our drive and braking. So with the handbrake on, in gear, we can try and move forward and we should feel resistance. The truck should certainly be struggling to move there. When we're driving, we use the service brake just to make sure the truck stops. And in a nice wide area, we can check our steering, make sure we're steering all the way one way and all the way back round the other way, just to make sure, again, it's a nice smooth operation, there's no interference. We certainly shouldn't have any jerky interference on the steering wheel. That way we're confident that all the systems are working as they should do.